October 25th, 1944, 7:45 in the morning, Mabalacat Airfield, Philippines. Lieutenant Yukio Seki climbed into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi Zero fighter for what he knew would be his final flight. Strapped beneath his aircraft was a 250-kilogram bomb, and in his heart was a mixture of duty, despair, and defiance that would define the most controversial tactic of World War II. In less than 4 hours, Seki's deliberate dive into the flight deck of USS St. Lo would give Japanese fighters their first major victory in months and launch a campaign of organized suicide attacks that would terrorize the Pacific Fleet for the remainder of the war. The 23-year-old pilot who would become the first kamikaze to sink an enemy ship was an unlikely candidate for such a desperate mission. Seki had questioned the wisdom of suicide attacks, telling a war correspondent just days earlier that Japan's future was bleak if it was forced to kill its best pilots. He was not flying for the Emperor or the Empire, he had said, but because he had been ordered to do so. Yet on this morning, as he led 4 other bomb-laden Zeros toward the American fleet off Leyte Gulf, Seki was about to prove that one pilot's suicidal dive could change the course of a battle and introduce a terrifying new dimension to naval warfare. This is the story of how Lieutenant Yukio Seki's attack on October 25, 1944, marked the beginning of the kamikaze era and gave Japanese forces their first significant victory against the overwhelmingly superior American Pacific Fleet. It was a victory born of desperation, executed by a reluctant hero, and achieved at a cost that would haunt both nations for generations. The success of Seki's mission would lead to over 3,800 additional kamikaze attacks, killing more than 7,000 Allied naval personnel, and fundamentally altering American naval tactics for the remainder of the war. The origins of the kamikaze tactic traced back to the desperate military situation facing Japan in October 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy had suffered catastrophic losses during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, an engagement American pilots dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot for the lopsided nature of Japanese aircraft losses. By autumn, Japan's once formidable carrier aviation force had been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, unable to conduct conventional operations against the massive American fleet that was steadily approaching the Japanese home islands. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi arrived in the Philippines on October 17th, with orders to defend the islands using the remnants of the First Air Fleet. The mathematical reality was stark. Japan possessed fewer than 100 operational aircraft to face an American invasion force protected by hundreds of fighters and dozens of aircraft carriers. Conventional attacks had proven utterly futile against American numerical superiority and technological advantages. Onishi concluded that only suicide attacks could achieve the kind of 1-to-1 exchange ratio that might influence the course of the battle. The concept was not entirely unprecedented in Japanese military culture. Individual acts of suicide attack had occurred throughout the Pacific War when pilots found themselves in hopeless situations with damaged aircraft or facing overwhelming odds. However, Onishi proposed something far more systematic: the deliberate organization of suicide attack units as a standard tactical method rather than a last resort. The plan called for volunteers to fly explosive-laden aircraft directly into American warships, trading certain death for the possibility of inflicting maximum damage on enemy forces. When Onishi presented his proposal to the officers of the 201st Air Group at Mabalacat Airfield, the response was immediate and overwhelming. 23 pilots volunteered for the first suicide mission, far more than the initial requirement. The enthusiasm surprised even Onishi, though it reflected the deep indoctrination in Bushido philosophy that emphasized death before dishonor and service to the emperor above personal survival. The volunteers understood they would not return from their missions, yet they competed for the privilege of leading the attack. Lieutenant Yukio Seki emerged as the natural choice to command the first official kamikaze unit. Born in Iyo Saijo on the island of Shikoku, Seki came from a middle-class family that operated an antique shop specializing in tea ceremony utensils. He had demonstrated exceptional academic and military prowess, graduating from the prestigious Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima and serving aboard the battleship Fuso before transitioning to naval aviation. His flying skills were outstanding, and his recent promotion to instructor at the Kasumigaura Flying Academy marked him as one of Japan's most promising young aviators. Despite his qualifications, Seki harbored serious reservations about suicide tactics. In September 1944, he had married Mariko Watanabe, the daughter of a family in Kamakura, with whom he had become close friends. The young couple had barely begun their life together when Seki received orders transferring him to the Philippines. His personal happiness made the prospect of certain death particularly painful, yet his sense of duty and obedience to military authority ultimately overcame his doubts about the mission. The formation of the Special Attack Unit, officially designated as the Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogeki Tai, or Divine Wind Special Attack Force, reflected both Japan's desperate circumstances and its cultural emphasis on spiritual strength over material power. The name referenced the typhoons that had destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in 1274 and 1281, suggesting that divine intervention might once again save Japan from foreign conquest. The symbolism was powerful, but the reality was that human pilots would have to accomplish what natural forces had achieved centuries earlier. Seki's unit was designated the Shikishima Squadron, named after an ancient poetic term for Japan. The four other pilots in his formation were equally young and capable: Naoshi Kano, Shigeo Ogino, Nobuo Tani, and Eiichi Aikawa. Each would fly a Mitsubishi A6M20 fighter, modified to carry a single 250-kilogram bomb beneath the fuselage. The aircraft were older models, but their lightweight construction and long range made them suitable for the intended mission. More importantly, they were expendable resources that Japan could afford to lose. The tactical plan developed for the first kamikaze attack reflected careful analysis of American fleet dispositions and defensive capabilities. Intelligence reports indicated that escort carriers represented the most vulnerable and valuable targets in the American formation. These smaller flat tops carried fewer defensive weapons than fleet carriers, but served crucial roles in providing air cover for amphibious operations. Sinking even one escort carrier would eliminate dozens of American aircraft and demonstrate the effectiveness of suicide tactics to both Japanese and American forces. On October 24th, Seki led his squadron on their first mission, but poor weather conditions prevented them from locating the American fleet. The abort was psychologically difficult for pilots who had prepared themselves for certain death, yet it provided additional time for final preparations and last-minute adjustments to tactics. Seki used the delay to write final letters to his wife and mother, expressing his love and his resignation to duty, while avoiding any mention of enthusiasm for the mission itself. The morning of October 25th dawned clear and calm, providing ideal conditions for the attack. Seki's 5 Zeros would be escorted by 4 additional fighters flown by some of Japan's most experienced pilots, including the legendary ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, who had been credited with over 80 victories during his combat career. The escort fighters would protect the suicide aircraft during their approach and provide accurate intelligence about the results of the attack for future planning purposes. At 7:45, the 9 aircraft lifted off from Mabalacat and began the 200-mile flight toward the reported position of the American fleet. The formation maintained radio silence during the approach, relying on visual navigation and pre-planned routes to avoid detection by American radar stations. The pilots flew at low altitude to minimize their radar signature, skimming just above the wave tops while scanning the horizon for signs of the enemy fleet that intelligence had reported in the area. The American force they sought was Task Unit 77.4.3, nicknamed Taffy 3, and commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The unit consisted of 6 escort carriers protected by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, a relatively light defensive force that had been assigned to provide air support for ground operations on Leyte. The carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinin Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay together embarked fewer than 200 aircraft, primarily fighters and torpedo bombers configured for ground attack rather than fleet defense. Unknown to the American crews, Taffy 3 had already survived one desperate engagement earlier that morning when Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force had surprised them in the battle off Samar. The Japanese surface fleet, including the massive battleship Yamato, had withdrawn after inflicting significant damage, but failing to complete the destruction of the escort carriers. The Americans were still recovering from that encounter when Seki's kamikaze formation appeared on their radar screens shortly after 10:30 in the morning. The sight of incoming aircraft initially caused little alarm aboard the escort carriers, as friendly air patrols were common throughout the area. However, the failure of the approaching aircraft to respond to radio challenges and their persistent approach toward the formation soon triggered general quarters alerts throughout Taffy 3. Anti-aircraft gunners rushed to their stations while fighter pilots on combat air patrol moved to intercept what was clearly an incoming attack formation. As Seki's formation approached the American ships, the escort fighters peeled off to engage defending Grumman Hellcats while the 5 suicide aircraft continued their attack runs. The kamikaze pilots had been instructed to select individual targets and attack independently to maximize the chance that at least some aircraft would reach their objectives. The dispersed attack pattern would force American defensive fire to divide among multiple targets, rather than concentrating on a single threat. Lieutenant Shigeo Ogino selected USS White Plains as his target and began his attack dive despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the carrier and her escorts. His Zero absorbed multiple hits during the approach, but the damage was insufficient to prevent him from completing his mission. At the last moment, however, defensive fire caused his aircraft to veer slightly off course, and instead of hitting White Plains directly, his plane exploded just off the carrier's port side. The near miss showered the ship with debris and caused 11 casualties, but White Plains remained operational. Nobuo Tani and Eiichi Aikawa both selected USS Kalinin Bay as their target, attacking from different angles to overwhelm the carrier's defenses. Tani's aircraft struck the flight deck near the aft elevator, penetrating into the hangar deck before his bomb exploded among parked aircraft. The blast caused severe damage and started fires that required hours to extinguish, but the carrier's damage control teams managed to keep her afloat and operational. Aikawa's plane hit the port catwalk, destroying the carrier's aftergun director and causing additional casualties. Naoshi Kano targeted USS Kitkun Bay, diving through heavy defensive fire that damaged his aircraft before impact. His Zero clipped the carrier's port catwalk before crashing into the sea alongside the ship. The explosion of his bomb underwater caused additional damage from fragments and shock, but like the other carriers attacked that morning, Kitkun Bay remained operational, despite the damage inflicted by the kamikaze assault. It was Yukio Seki who achieved the mission's primary objective when he selected USS St. Lo as his target. The escort carrier, originally launched as USS Midway before being renamed to avoid confusion with the larger fleet carrier of the same name, was conducting routine flight operations when Seki began his final attack dive. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners opened fire immediately, but the Japanese pilot maintained his course through the defensive barrage with determination that impressed even his enemies. Contemporary accounts describe Seki's approach as textbook perfect, maintaining optimal speed and angle despite the intense defensive fire directed at his aircraft. At approximately 10:51, his Zero struck the center of St. Lo's flight deck and penetrated into the hangar deck below, where his 250-kilogram bomb exploded among aircraft that were being refueled and rearmed for combat missions. The explosion triggered a series of secondary blasts as aviation gasoline ignited and ordnance detonated in a cascading series of increasingly powerful explosions. The catastrophic damage caused by Seki's attack exceeded even the most optimistic Japanese projections for kamikaze effectiveness. The initial explosion had ruptured fuel lines and started fires that quickly spread throughout the ship's interior spaces. Secondary explosions destroyed the flight deck and collapsed portions of the hangar deck, while toxic smoke filled compartments throughout the vessel. Despite heroic damage control efforts by the crew, the fires continued to spread and intensify as additional ordnance exploded in the mounting conflagration. Captain Francis McKenna ordered abandon ship at 11:10, less than 20 minutes after Seki's attack. The crew had fought valiantly to save their vessel, but the extent of the damage made survival impossible. At 11:25, exactly 34 minutes after the kamikaze impact, USS St. Lo rolled over and sank, taking with her the lives of 113 officers and enlisted men. Another 30 survivors would later die from their wounds, bringing the total American casualties from Seki's single attack to 143 killed. The sinking of St. Lo marked the first major warship lost to kamikaze attack and validated the tactical concept that Admiral Onishi had proposed just 8 days earlier. A single pilot in an obsolete fighter aircraft had accomplished what conventional bombing attacks had repeatedly failed to achieve: the destruction of an enemy capital ship. The success ratio was unprecedented in naval aviation history, demonstrating that suicide tactics could indeed achieve the one-to-one exchange rates that Japanese planners desperately needed to influence the course of the war. News of the kamikaze success spread rapidly through Japanese military channels, where it was hailed as proof that spiritual strength could overcome material disadvantage. Emperor Hirohito personally commended the sacrifice of Seki and his comrades, while military leaders began immediate preparations for expanded suicide operations. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was enormous, providing hope that determined resistance might yet prevent American conquest of the Philippines and the home islands. The American reaction was equally significant, though characterized by shock and concern rather than celebration. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, immediately ordered comprehensive analysis of the kamikaze threat and development of new defensive measures. The deliberate nature of the attacks represented a fundamental change in Japanese tactics that required corresponding adjustments in American naval operations and defensive planning. Medical personnel treating survivors from St. Lo reported psychological trauma, unlike anything previously encountered in the Pacific War. The knowledge that enemy pilots were deliberately seeking death rather than attempting to survive their attacks created new forms of combat stress among American sailors. Traditional defensive tactics assumed that enemy pilots would attempt to escape after completing their attacks, but kamikaze pilots would continue their runs despite fatal damage to their aircraft. The success of October 25th led to immediate expansion of kamikaze operations throughout the Philippines campaign. Admiral Onishi organized additional special attack units within days of receiving reports about St. Lo's sinking, while other Japanese commanders requested permission to form their own suicide squadrons. The tactic spread from naval aviation to Army Air Forces and eventually to other branches of the military as Japan's strategic situation continued to deteriorate. The second kamikaze mission launched on October 26th, followed by increasingly frequent attacks as more pilots volunteered for suicide duties. Each successful attack reinforced Japanese confidence in the tactic, while simultaneously horrifying American personnel, who had to defend against enemies who actively sought death rather than victory. The psychological warfare aspect of kamikaze attacks proved almost as effective as their physical destruction of ships and aircraft. Statistical analysis of kamikaze effectiveness revealed sobering realities about the changing nature of Pacific naval warfare. While individual success rates remained relatively low, with perhaps 10 to 15% of suicide aircraft actually hitting their targets, the damage inflicted by successful attacks far exceeded that of conventional bombing or torpedo attacks. A single kamikaze hit could sink or permanently disable vessels that might survive multiple conventional attacks. The expansion of kamikaze operations coincided with the American invasion of Luzon and subsequent battles for the Philippines. Japanese suicide attacks sank or damaged dozens of American vessels during these campaigns, forcing significant changes in fleet operations and defensive procedures. Combat air patrols were strengthened, anti-aircraft defenses were enhanced, and new radar-guided weapons were rushed into service to counter the suicide threat. Training programs for new kamikaze pilots emphasized the spiritual aspects of their mission, while providing practical instruction in aircraft recognition and attack techniques. Young men barely out of their teens learned to identify different classes of American warships and select the most valuable targets for their sacrifice. The systematic nature of the training reflected the institutionalization of suicide attacks as a standard Japanese military tactic rather than a desperate expedient. The psychological preparation of kamikaze pilots involved intensive indoctrination in imperial ideology and Bushido philosophy, emphasizing duty to emperor and nation above personal survival. However, personal letters and diaries from suicide pilots reveal complex emotions that included fear, sadness, and doubt alongside patriotic determination. Many pilots, like Seki himself, questioned the wisdom of the tactic, while accepting their duty to carry out orders from superior officers. American intelligence efforts focused intensively on understanding Japanese kamikaze organization and predicting future attacks. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed the systematic nature of suicide pilot training and the extent of Japanese commitment to the tactic. These intelligence reports influenced American strategic planning for the anticipated invasion of Japan, where massive kamikaze attacks were expected to defend the home islands. The Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945 represented the climax of kamikaze warfare, with over 1,500 suicide aircraft participating in coordinated attacks against the American invasion fleet. The intensity and scale of these attacks exceeded anything previously experienced in naval warfare, with multiple waves of kamikazes attacking simultaneously from different directions. The campaign cost the U.S. Navy more casualties than any other operation in its history, largely due to kamikaze attacks. Technology development accelerated on both sides as the kamikaze threat influenced weapons design and tactics. Japan developed specialized suicide aircraft, including the rocket-powered Oka flying bomb, while Americans deployed proximity-fused ammunition and radar-guided guns specifically designed to counter kamikaze attacks. The arms race between suicide tactics and defensive countermeasures drove innovation throughout the final year of the Pacific War. The social impact of kamikaze operations extended far beyond military considerations, influencing Japanese civilian morale and American public opinion about the war's conduct and probable duration. News of suicide attacks reinforced American perceptions of Japanese fanaticism while simultaneously demonstrating the determination with which Japan would defend its home territory. These perceptions influenced American decision-making about the use of atomic weapons and alternatives to invasion. International law and military ethics struggled to categorize kamikaze attacks within existing frameworks for legitimate warfare. While suicide attacks were not explicitly prohibited by international conventions, their deliberate nature raised questions about the treatment of captured suicide pilots and the broader implications of tactics that rejected traditional concepts of military victory and survival. Post-war analysis revealed the strategic limitations of kamikaze tactics despite their tactical successes. While suicide attacks inflicted significant damage on Allied forces, they also consumed Japan's remaining experienced pilots and aircraft at an unsustainable rate. The 1-to-1 exchange ratio achieved by successful kamikazes could not compensate for the overwhelming numerical superiority of American forces and industrial production. The legacy of Yukio Seki and the first kamikaze attack continued to influence military thinking and popular culture for decades after the war's end. Seki became a complex figure in Japanese memory, simultaneously honored as a patriotic hero and mourned as a victim of militaristic excess. His reluctant acceptance of the suicide mission reflected the complicated emotions surrounding kamikaze operations and their place in Japanese national memory. Modern analysis of kamikaze effectiveness has been complicated by both American and Japanese propaganda that exaggerated the success of suicide attacks for different purposes. American sources sometimes inflated kamikaze casualties to emphasize the fanaticism of Japanese resistance, while Japanese sources exaggerated the damage inflicted to justify the sacrifice of thousands of young pilots. Accurate assessment requires careful analysis of contemporary records from both sides. The technological lessons learned from defending against kamikaze attacks influenced post-war naval development, particularly in the areas of radar, guided missiles, and close-in weapons systems. The threat of high-speed, low-altitude attacks by determined enemies became a permanent consideration in naval vessel design and fleet defensive planning throughout the Cold War period. Cultural representations of kamikaze pilots in literature, film, and popular media have evolved significantly over the decades since World War II. Early American portrayals emphasized the fanatical nature of suicide attacks, while Japanese treatments focused on the tragic sacrifice of young men for their country. Modern perspectives attempt to understand the complex motivations and circumstances that led to the institutionalization of suicide tactics. The medical and psychological study of kamikaze pilots and their victims contributed to understanding of combat stress, survivor guilt, and the long-term effects of extreme warfare on human psychology. Veterans of both sides struggled with memories of suicide attacks, whether as participants or targets, creating unique forms of post-traumatic stress that influenced military medicine and veteran care. Educational treatment of kamikaze operations remains sensitive in both Japan and the United States, reflecting different national perspectives on the legitimacy and effectiveness of suicide tactics. Japanese schools emphasize the sacrifice and patriotism of kamikaze pilots while acknowledging the tragic waste of young lives, while American curricula focus on the terror and damage inflicted by suicide attacks while recognizing the desperation that drove their adoption. Contemporary military analysis of asymmetric warfare and terrorism often references kamikaze tactics as a historical precedent for suicide attacks against technologically superior enemies. The psychological impact of kamikaze operations provides insights into the effectiveness of tactics that rely on terror and unpredictability rather than conventional military superiority. The commemoration of Yukio Seki and his fellow kamikaze pilots reflects ongoing debates about heroism, sacrifice, and the morality of warfare. Memorial sites in Japan honor their memory while acknowledging the tragedy of their deaths, while American memorials focus on the victims of kamikaze attacks and the courage of those who defended against them. These different perspectives illustrate the lasting complexity of judging historical events from multiple national viewpoints. Scientific study of kamikaze aircraft and tactics has provided insights into the technical aspects of suicide attacks, including optimal approach angles, target selection criteria, and defensive countermeasures. This research contributes to understanding of both historical events and contemporary security challenges involving suicide attacks against military and civilian targets. The personal story of Yukio Seki continues to resonate because it humanizes one of the most controversial tactics of World War II. His doubts about suicide attacks, his love for his wife, and his sense of duty to his country reflect the complex emotions that drove thousands of young men to accept certain death in service of their nation. Understanding these individual motivations helps explain how systematic suicide attacks became possible within Japanese military culture. On October 25, 1944, at 10:51 in the morning, Lieutenant Yukio Seki completed his final dive into the flight deck of USS St. Lo, achieving the first major victory for Japanese suicide tactics and inaugurating a campaign that would terrorize Allied forces for the remainder of World War II. His reluctant heroism and the success of his mission demonstrated that even a losing side could inflict terrible costs on a superior enemy through the ultimate sacrifice of its most precious resource, the lives of its young people. The suicidal dive that Seki had initially questioned became the foundation for a tactic that claimed over 3,800 Japanese lives, while killing more than 7,000 Allied personnel. His legacy remains complex and controversial, representing both the depths of human dedication and the tragedy of warfare that demands such ultimate sacrifices. The first kamikaze attack proved that one pilot's final mission could indeed change the course of battle, but at a cost that revealed the true horror of total war.